Thank you, Senator Torres. Senator Wright and then Senator Mitchell.
Yeah, I think, though, the businesses who we get the money from ultimately pass the cost on. I mean, I think more in line with what Senator Torres was saying, businesses don't pay taxes either. The people who buy the product from the business do. So, so if you reverse that question, the LADWP will get some credits, but they're not going to get money, they're going to get credits because the credit is kind of an allowance. Now, then if they develop a program, the program is actually going to be financed by the ratepayers of the DWP. We're not giving them any money. I think it's kind of disingenuous to suggest that they somehow got money. They didn't. Now, the greenhouse gas reduction goal is a good one, but at the end of the day, somebody has got to put the money up, and it's going to come from either the consumer of whatever that business is or that utility becomes. I think, and the goal could be good, and I think that we should keep that going. I would hope, for example, if we take weatherization, if the state engages in that through the IOUs, the municipals do theirs a little differently. But one of the fights that we've had, certainly in LA County, is that there are two large community groups who've been involved in weatherization for 20 some odd years. The Watts Labor Community Action Committee in South LA and Teleco in East LA. I spent 3 years fighting to keep the PUC from taking their money. They still have their programs. If the state's now going to engage in weatherization, I would hope that you would either partner with them to expand what they're doing, because what the PUC wanted to do is take it from them and give it to corporate groups, which would have, they actually go into communities that are disadvantaged and hire people that the major construction companies would not hire. So I would hope that we would not, in effect, replace Teleco and WLCAC. There's another group in Fresno, whatever their name was.
And they're local. Yes.
Yeah, but that we would keep those community groups in the program if we do it.
That's the intent.
The other side is that on the bills that people pay, whether again it's Edison or Sempra or PG&E, there's already a category now for weatherization. They're already paying that. So are we now going to add to what they already pay? Is this going to be in addition to? Because there's a take rate and there's a process that they've been working toward. So if we just say weatherization, it sounds good, but it suggests that there's already not a weatherization program in place.
My understanding, and I didn't develop this particular program, but working with the energy agencies, their goal is, and this is very much a product of the kind of process that we talked about earlier, where the communities had input into this program. This program was deemed by the environmental justice groups that participated to be their highest priority, that there be funding to build upon the existing programs and expand them. So it's not replacing, it's not duplicating, it's intended to actually assist in making those programs more widely available, because they are very successful and well-liked.
And if I can underscore that point, the program that it's building on was actually ARA funds. There was an ARA program that provided one-time money for these types of projects, and the ARA funds essentially were fully spent and expired. So this would provide essentially an infusion of additional money to continue what appeared to be a pretty successful program.
Well, a bit of history, and I'm just old. Many years ago, we used to fund weatherization out of what was called then the public goods charge. Then that shifted, and we let some other people steal the money, and the legislature then said we're not going to do it, and the PUC is now in litigation because they believe they can continue doing something that required a 2/3 vote of the legislature. Apart from that, many years ago, the legislature also began to set up, again, community programs. This goes back into the 70s. And that was when WLCAC, the Watts Labor Community Action Committee, and Teleco, the East Los Angeles Community Union, and the guy in Fresno, there are about 6 community groups around the state. Well, in the 90s, or excuse me, in the early 2000s, the funds were shifted from the public goods charge to a separate charge on people's bills. So the public goods charge that's currently in place doesn't fund weatherization, it's funded separately. So if what you're now going to do is supplant that program, either adding to it, what have you, then one of the things that I would suggest is that the costs that they're currently bearing for the weatherization should come out, and then we should replace it with the money that you're going to spend, so that we would spend the same amount of money or more, but rather than have the people pay that on their bill, that it doesn't get shifted again, so that they thought that they were getting something and they get what we call in South LA the booby prize, where they didn't get nothing at all, but their money kept flowing out. So we should verify that weatherization is a real program. It currently exists. It has for 40 plus years, and if we're going to add to it, that's one thing, then we would add to it and increase the take rate of people. And again, it provides jobs, it does something. The other thing that I would hope that we would keep in mind is that, as Ms. Nichols mentioned, if you look at a residential electric bill, it ain't but about 10 to 12% of the cost is the energy anyway. The other cost is infrastructure. So what you also have to be careful is that you can end up where the success of your program results in a higher kilowatt charge to the people because you have a smaller platform over which to disperse the cost, right? I mean, the meter reader who comes to somebody's house, his cost isn't based on how much electricity was consumed. And if you back into the other parts of the system, most of it is not consumptive. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do energy efficiency, because you can always make systems better. But the lower your consumption is, the less benefit you tend to get from it, because you could end up, I mean, I first experienced this, and it was kind of bizarre in LA when we had a water crisis, and the DWP was very successful at reducing water consumption. And then people thought, well, damn, I used half as much water, so my bill should be half as much. And lo and behold, the bill went up 15%. So people wanted somebody's ass to kick, and there were no volunteers. So then you had to explain to people that the fact that the consumption went down didn't do anything about the conveyance and all the other things that you had to do to move the water. So people who were thinking they were going to get a discount because that's what they were told didn't get one, and their bill went up, and so then they were mad, understandably. So once again, you have to be careful that you don't say to someone, your bill's going to go down because we're going to do the weatherization, and then they get the bill and the bill goes up because you have a smaller platform to disperse the fixed cost. I think the other dynamic that we should be careful about is, unlike Ms. Torres, I've actually been to Madrid, and I've ridden the line from Seville to Madrid. It's an excellent, and I haven't been to Korea, so you got, but on that line, I think, as Ms. Torres pointed out, for example, if you go to Geneva, Switzerland, when you go downstairs, you can catch the train to wherever it is you need to go, or you can catch a bus someplace else. So at the Geneva airport, downstairs, you can do that. If you go to Frankfurt, Germany, you can get on a train and go literally at the airport. Our systems are so antiquated in that context that in Europe, you have probably a fraction of per capita vehicles purchased because people are so much more reliant on public transportation. So be careful as you say, wow, you're going to have this huge increase. What happened there is that they, many years ago, had cities that weren't designed for cars in the first place. So people had always done that. That's true in Italy. That's true in, I mean, what they said, Mussolini, part of his hustle was that he made the trains run on time. I'm just saying, they have been into trains and stuff for a long time. I mean, the Orient Express was a luxury travel. I mean, compared to what we have here, particularly in California, even comparing California to the East Coast, where transportation in New York, they have far fewer cars purchased because people use it more. Be careful how you line that out, because Mrs. Torres was absolutely correct. A whole lot of people who live in Compton ain't trying to go to San Francisco on the light rail, but they might be trying to get to downtown LA on the blue line. So you want to make sure that you're contributing to that portion as well and looking at it system-wide. I think, you know, finally, and I know I was just saying a lot, that I hope that, again, what we would do if we're going to do the light rail, that we resolve the legal issues. I mean, I know you still got some hurdles to make sure that the federal dollars even arrive. I don't know if we resolved those issues yet, relative to the federal participation in the program and what the conditions were that we got the money in the first place.
Well, we are clearly still working through legal issues. There's no question about that. We have a petition before the court now on some of that stuff. But you know, we will work through those legal issues. I mean, one way or the other, we're approaching it one way now to try to remove some of the risk of ongoing litigation by a decision of an appellate court. If that goes against us, we'll have to take other steps towards compliance with the Superior Court ruling. And the authority will. They're prepared to move forward on that. It's important to note that the court did not unwind the appropriation that this legislature made to move forward on the project. And that the project is moving forward with contracts for construction moving forward and whatnot. We are still in absolute compliance with the federal government on our financing agreement with them, and they are still participating in that, as are we. So, we are moving forward on that score, and we do still have to work through some of those issues.
I mentioned earlier, and it was at the previous panel, about leakage. I mean, are we going to actually monitor emissions in addition to counting up how much money we collect? Because again, I mean, at the rate that we had been going for a while, particularly on the manufacturing sector, we could have ended up meeting our emissions target just by the number of people who went out of business. I mean, that wouldn't have been the intention, certainly. But I'm just saying, I mean, if you think about, you know, I mean, we used to make, again, having grown up in Southern California, we used to make a lot of steel. We're down to one. We used to make a lot of airplanes. We're down to none. The C-17 program, they didn't refund it. We didn't get the 777X, so that ain't going to happen. Northrop Grumman is on the end of the B-2 project. That ain't coming back. The shuttle is gone. We ain't doing that. We're, you know, the guy in SpaceX in my district is really pissed because the county is charging him property tax for the rocket that he uses. So the guy at SpaceX in Hawthorne is ticked off. We no longer make tires. We used to make 30% of those made in. I mean, I'm just saying we could end up getting to our goal simply by, I mean, fortunately, we're going to get a reprieve because the people who were doing the Panama Canal overspent, and they don't know what the hell they're doing. They're $12 billion right now into the project. They spent too much to stop, and they don't have enough money to finish it. So that might be a reprieve for us because they may have, you know, just shot themselves in the foot. But I'm just saying, I hope we're looking at the totality and saying that we have an emissions goal as opposed to, you know, getting in front of just saying how much money we get to spend. Because now I'm like what Senator Bell was. If the emissions goal comes down and the business isn't there won't be no money.
This is a program that's designed to work with the rest of AB 32 in a way that shows that we can decarbonize our economy and make it more sustainable. At the same time, we're growing our state economically. We're obviously at the early stages of this program,
right.
And we're collecting data. We will be putting out, I hope, a pretty good report on this issue of leakage, either by the end of this year or early next year, that really evaluates what happened. But I would definitely encourage you and your colleagues to look at this expenditure plan, not just as a how did we spend money, but what did we get for the money that we spent.
And I would hope, too, that, I mean, I've heard kind of anecdotally that the economy's growing, except, again, when I look around, I tend to look at industrial and manufacturing stuff because those were the jobs that were around when I was there. I don't see those. I mean, I see a lot of things that are more service-oriented, but I'm not seeing, I mean, my discussions with our own Manufacturers Association suggest that we're getting our asses kicked. But, I mean, that doesn't mean the economy doesn't grow, but it means where does it grow? And the kind of growth that we're experiencing actually contributes to income inequality and creates another set of problems that I hope that, you know, we'll be able to confront. I mean, if we lose that steel plant, those jobs pay real money to people who typically don't have the same type of skill sets that would get them $70,000 and $80,000 jobs doing something else. So I would hope, again, we would look not just at the growth in the economy, but the kind of growth and the kind of job that we're producing. The service sector doesn't provide anywhere near the level of income that people are going to need. Neither does the tourism business. It's nice to have, but
construction jobs are good
Yeah,
jobs, too.
construction jobs are pretty good jobs.
construction jobs are pretty good. Those work.
Yeah, I mean, just again, referencing the business plan that just came forward, it's got consistent jobs numbers with the one from 2012 for the construction of this project, as well as a estimate of the permanent jobs that would be in place with the high-speed rail system here.
And I'm into the high-speed rail system. I mean, I'm like the chairman. I'm a part of the converted, but you still have to do it wisely, I think.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Senator Wright. Senator Mitchell, and then I think we're going to be ready to move on to our last panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll keep it brief to two questions. First of all, I'm curious, I'm looking at the cap and trade expenditure plan, your plan of how to allocate $850 million. I've got a chart. The proposed trailer bill language that was shared just today increases your allocation, a continuous appropriation, to $400 million for high-speed rail authority. How does that break down according to your chart, where it was previously 300, which was 250 to the high-speed rail and 50 to rail modernization? So tell me how the 400 now impacts your 850. How does that work?
Right. The trailer bill that was made public yesterday includes provisions for 15-16 budget year going forward. So
it doesn't impact this here?
Correct. So the expenditure plan that you are looking at here represents the budget year 14-15 year, in which we would spend $250 million. But as we committed in our Jan 10 proposal, we also were going to propose a ongoing commitment to the project, and the trailer bill essentially represents the ongoing commitment.
And so that 400 is all for high-speed rail, or does any of that 400 go to rail modernization?
A high-speed rail project.
Okay, and I ask that because we had the conversation about sustainable communities, the $100 million. I'm curious how you arrived at these numbers. If these were, pulleys, or if they were really grounded based on what you think the true cost will be to do the work we need to do in communities around these issues, around sustainable communities, around rail modernization. Were they based on reality?
I would say they were based on, we used a very safe revenue number that was in line with what the current auction proceeds were. So the first step was to figure out what a safe revenue assumption would be without recognizing all the uncertainty about projecting auction proceeds going forward. Then we, again, were informed by the public input at the stakeholder hearings, at the stakeholder meetings, the legislation, and we wanted, the numbers essentially represent a alignment with where the highest emission is in sector. So transportation, for example, is the highest expenditure category. Sustainable communities was part of that, and we're just it was trying to take where the highest emission reductions were, and then use that to inform where the dollars should be spent.
Was that same methodology used in determining for your 15-16 the $400 million allocation for the high-speed rail?
Yeah, so
that area has the highest?
Transportation as a whole. And so
it's just lumped together?
Transportation as a whole, and we were trying to achieve a balanced portfolio of short-term expenditures that would result in immediate emission reductions as well as long-term transformative projects. So the 33% really represents the fact that we want to spend money that would result in transformational changes in the long term, but we don't want the entire amount to be for transformational changes. We want short-term too. So again, it's a portfolio.
My second question has to do with disadvantaged communities. I was intrigued by the repeated suggestion that your definition of disadvantaged communities suggests that we have an overlay in terms of the geographic area where the high-speed rail will go. The Cal and Biro screen has listed the top 10% of zip codes considered disadvantaged based on three critical factors: pollution burden, sensitive populations, and socioeconomic factors. Is that the same definition you're using
Yes,
for
that's
disadvantaged
right.
communities?
That's right. So the Enviro Screen report that was developed by Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment has a map that identifies those zip codes, and there's a lot of disadvantaged communities that were identified in Southern California, but also in the Central Valley. And you can see from Fresno through Bakersfield, there's a very high portion of it, and I think that's what we were alluding to, was that Central Valley identification, that you could do an overlay of the high-speed rail project, and that's where the benefit would.
So I'm asking the two questions. They're really very interrelated. As I think about disadvantaged communities and the percentage of the entire expenditure plan that's going to be allocated to those communities, just really curious about how we then come up with a continuous appropriation of such a level that where the other expenditures impacting other areas of the state really pale in comparison. So that's why I wanted to really understand your methodology for coming up with this continuous appropriation that will impact some of the disadvantaged communities, but certainly not all of them.
That's right. And so our intent is to, and the expenditure plan, as I alluded to, would achieve the 25% benefit to disadvantaged communities even without high-speed rail. So we were just alluding to the fact that high-speed rail, if you do an overlay, would achieve a benefit, but between the weatherization program, the sustainable communities, the low-carbon transportation, the plan is to benefit disadvantaged communities even without high-speed rail.
And are we bound to the 25% indefinitely?
That's, I think, at least 25% is what it says. It's a floor.
It's the same if the number's higher.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Mitchell. Mr. Secretary, Madam Chair, Mr. Almy, thank you for your time, and Ms. Roberts as well.
And members, thank you.
Secretary Kelly, as you leave the panel, I just want to make the point that I know we're all very eager to see what the funding plan will be. I know it is now beginning to be circulated through the new business plan. Is this it's in draft form now?
Yes.
Okay.
It's in draft form now. It's available for a 60-day period for public
All right.
comment.
We're all very eager to see it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Committee members, we are on our third and last panel, and then, of course, we'll be here for public comment. We want to welcome Dr. Hannock, who is co-director of research at the Public Policy Institution of California, also Dr. Horowitz, executive director of Emmett Center on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA, and additionally Dr. Sperling, who's the director at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. Welcome to all of you.
Some part of it.
Who would like
Thank
to
you,
begin?
Senator Leonard. I think I'll start.
You're welcome to.
I'm pleased to be here. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Kara Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of the Emmett Center on Climate Change at UCLA Law School. We're an academic and nonpartisan analysis center that focuses on climate change law and policy. And I'm here today to address some of the legal constraints on spending California's auction proceeds. Can you hear me okay? I have a little bit of a cold. Thanks. And I have just two main conclusions that I want to emphasize. I know it's been a long morning, so I'll try and be brief, even though it's against the nature of lawyers. First, generally speaking, the state has a fair amount of leeway in deciding how to allocate these funds. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is so. So while AB 32 authorizes the use of market-based mechanisms for achieving greenhouse gas reductions, as you know, it doesn't dictate how to spend auction revenue. Other sources of law, including several we've talked a lot about today, SB 535, AB 1532, and others, require that auction revenues are spent in ways that first further the regulatory aims of AB 32, second benefit disadvantaged communities, and third, facilitate the reduction of greenhouse gases in the state. And while reducing greenhouse gas emissions is the primary aim of AB 32, the legislature has repeatedly emphasized, as you all know, that it places value on achieving a set of public policy goals in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, AB 1532 says that auction revenues shall be used to the extent feasible in ways that maximize the economic, environmental, and public health benefits, foster job creation, and lessen the impact of climate change in the state, among other things. These additional policy goals mean that the state can and must balance many priorities in making revenue expenditure decisions. And while this provides some elements of constraint to this committee and to the legislature, it also provides some degrees of freedom. Since there are many reasonable choices to be made between and amongst these priorities, and the state is empowered to make those choices in essentially any reasonable way it sees fit. So that's not to say there isn't a spectrum of legal risk involved. Some revenue expenditures are certainly more risky than others. The legislature has said that the state cannot spend money in ways that do not further AB 32's regulatory goals. So, for example, the state likely could not fund a project the sole benefit of which was to help communities adapt to climate change, if that project did not also come with greenhouse gas reductions. To advance adaptation, a less risky approach would be to fund projects that result in both greenhouse gas reductions and adaptation benefits. But it's my view that there's considerably less legal risk at play for the range of decisions being contemplated in this proposed budget than some others have concluded or implied. So, for example, one might ask, how risky is it to choose to spend auction revenue in a way that does not maximize absolute greenhouse gas emission reductions? Or how risky is it to choose to spend those monies in a way that does not maximize the cost effectiveness of projects as measured by the cost per ton of greenhouse gases reduced? My answer is it's actually not legally risky to do those things at all. Nothing in the law requires the state to maximize its greenhouse gas reductions with this auction revenue. Similarly, nothing requires the state to choose only those projects that reduce greenhouse gases at the lowest cost per ton. In fact, complementary policies that we've talked about today to some extent, articulated in AB 32, AB 1532, and SB 535, suggest that, to the contrary, the state should choose projects that reduce greenhouse gases while achieving other laudable goals, such as creating jobs, benefiting disadvantaged communities, reducing leakage, improving public health, even if doing so comes at the cost of maximizing greenhouse gas emissions. Reductions, or of making reductions marginally more expensive. So the multiple priorities articulated by the legislature tend to undermine arguments in favor of strictly using and employing greenhouse gas-centric metrics as a way of choosing how to spend these revenues, which by definition cannot take account of other benefits that some projects may provide. One might also ask, how risky is it to spend auction revenue largely or entirely outside capped sectors, outside the sectors that are actually controlled by the cap and trade program? And that's an issue that's been raised this morning too. Again, I conclude it's not risky, legally risky, to spend money outside capped sectors. Nothing in the state statute or the Constitution limits California's ability to spend auction funds on projects outside the cap. Auction money is required to be spent in ways that further AB 32's goals, not the goals of the cap and trade program itself. And here, AB 32 asks for reductions in statewide emissions, and as we've discussed, has goals that are considerably broader than the cap and trade program. And finally, I'll ask how risky it is to spend money on projects that result in greenhouse gas emission reductions only after 2020, again, relevant to the high-speed rail proposal and other proposals. My view is that this raises the legal risk somewhat, but still not very high. AB 32's emission reduction requirements do not hit a brick wall in 2020, as another speaker this morning has discussed. Instead, the statute calls for greenhouse gas limits to remain in effect past 2020 and to be used to maintain and continue reductions in emissions of greenhouse gases beyond 2020. Because California's economy and population will presumably continue to grow beyond 2020, but the statewide limit remains static, the limit effectively becomes more stringent over time. And this seems to me to be a fair justification for funding greenhouse gas reduction efforts that yield reductions even well past 2020. For all of these reasons, again, I conclude the state has significant amount of legal flexibility in choosing how to spend these funds. My second point is brief. It relates to the degree of certainty about achieving greenhouse gas reductions that the state needs in order to fund a project. AB 1532 requires that money be allocated only after the state has determined, based on available evidence, that the use of those monies furthers the regulatory purposes of AB 32. This determination need not use any particular metric, but should be reasonably based on a well-developed record. And courts will tend to show deference to the findings of the state and to expert agencies here. So with this, I thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to answering questions. I know my fellow panelists have more to say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horowitz. We appreciate you being with us today, and we're going to hold our questions for you until we hear from the rest of the panel. Dr. Hanek, looks like you're prepared to go next.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. I'm going to tee off of what Kara has just talked about and think about a little bit about how to think of multiple benefits from this spending. And we've heard a lot this morning about the multiple benefits in terms of addressing special needs and disadvantaged communities. The budget proposal also emphasizes the idea of job creation. And I'd like us to think for a little bit about how well the proposal does at an integrated climate policy approach. And by that I mean, on the one hand, mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, and on the other hand, adaptation and preparing for some of the changes that we know are going to be inevitable, even if there's not only California's success, but global success in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the state has invested a lot of research in trying to understand what those impacts are. We have a pretty good sense of at least some of them now. We're already experiencing higher temperatures, accelerated sea level rise. We know with a fair degree of certainty that we're going to be experiencing more frequent extreme events. You can't pinpoint the current drought and say that this is directly a result of climate change, but we know that extreme events of the types of droughts, floods, storms, wildfires, extreme heat emergencies are going to be more a part of our future than they have been in the past. And the drought this year just kind of highlights in a way how we need to be able to prepare for those kinds of things, which are costly to Californians, both to the society and to the economy, in the same way that there can be costs to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So sort of think about using the auction revenues as a way of alleviating costs in relation to climate. It's useful to kind of have that as something to keep in mind as well. Now, fortunately, there are a number of types of mitigation measures that are complementary with adaptation and preparing for a changing climate. It's not always true, but it's true in a number of cases, and I'll just give you a few examples. One of them is anything that does contributes to energy efficiency and weatherization, demand management of energy. That's something that's going to help reduce peak demands and help get us through the higher temperatures that we're going to be experiencing. Anything that improves water use efficiency also saves energy, but it helps simultaneously with coping with water scarcity and drought management. The sustainable communities programs, sometimes is in a broader sense called smart growth. Transit-oriented development and more walkable communities can reduce greenhouse gas emissions through lessening solo driving, but if done right, can also lower the water footprint. It can lower the energy footprint in ways that make us more resilient and able to handle some of the impacts that we're going to be expecting from climate change. So, and maybe just one on those are all sort of energy reducing, emissions reducing kinds of things. Forestry management is on the side of how to store carbon, can be very valuable. It can also be really valuable if done right in thinking about how to minimize the negative impacts of wildfires that we're going to be expecting, which are important not just for habitat and for households and businesses that are living in very fire-prone areas, but also for water supply. And we really dodged a bullet last year with the Rim Fire. I'll just say, Senator Leno and I are relying on the same water system that dodged that bullet. But that was not just San Francisco. That was a large part of Silicon Valley that was very lucky. And if you think about the drought now, how lucky that wildfire did not cause the problems that it might have to water quality. But this is really something to think about in our upper watersheds, really across the state. So, if we look at the governor's proposal, there's not a lot of discussion about the adaptation side of things, but there are a number of elements in there that can get these dual benefits. I sort of went through the checklist. There's some that are clearly complementary. The weatherization programs in homes, energy efficiency in state buildings, water use efficiency, and the forest fire prevention. Those are kind of pretty much no-brainer dual benefits. The details matter in how you do it in terms of where you save water, you'll save more energy in some parts of the state than others, and so on. But overall, they kind of can be quite complementary automatically. There are some other parts of the proposal that are potentially complementary, depending on how you implement it. And I would say that the Sustainable Communities Grants is one of those, where if the only thing that you worry about is transit-oriented development, you might miss some of those other benefits that help get you get the community to be more resilient in terms of its water footprint, for example, or its energy footprint. And to the extent that we're talking about new development projects, that's a perfect time to come in a relatively low-cost way to make sure that you're really getting the best green overall communities built in those places. And that's kind of guidance that the legislature might want to think about giving if the administration isn't already offering that. I would say another one where it can be complementary if you think about it well is urban forestry, which done right, in addition to just improving the condition of communities and the open space, it can be saving energy for you by sort of cooling down certain places. Done not carefully, it can also increase water demand in ways that are not great. So that we have options with certain kinds of tree species that are not so thirsty. Also, we have options to build those to put those trees in ways that can help us handle storms that are going to be more frequent. People talk about low impact development, green infrastructure. A lot of the things that urban communities are doing now to try to make the streets more complete and walkable and bikeable and all of that, if you're also building planters that purposefully are going to be capturing stormwater, you're getting multiple bangs for your buck. So that's a kind of a consideration too. Now when I add up all of these sort of either automatically complementary or potentially complementary areas, we're looking at about $300 million of the $850 million. So a little bit more than a third, which maybe that's enough for that particular dual objective, but I wouldn't be sorry to see more go into forestry and upper watershed, just from the dual perspectives, depending on what other considerations people want to think about balancing. And then just in closing, I wanted to leave you with a couple of thoughts, just to reiterate that the cap and trade program in and of itself is designed to reduce the costs of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's the whole idea of trading, as opposed to just capping. So if we want to think about contributing to reducing the costs of climate change, and not just about the specific meeting of AB 32's 2020 targets, then it makes sense to think about reducing the costs of preparing for a changing climate. And then I just end with a little bit of an insight from what Californians have been saying about this. We do annual surveys at PPAC every summer on the environment and asking questions about climate policy. In the most recent survey in July of 2013, there was a question asking people, do you think it's important that the state pass regulations and spend money now on efforts to reduce global warming? 8 out of 10 said yes. Either very important or at least somewhat important. 8 out of 10 also said that it's important to pass regulations and to spend money now on efforts to prepare for the effects of global warming. So I think Californians would like to see this dual approach to climate, and you have an opportunity to do that with these revenues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hannock. Great to have you here. And we welcome Dr. Sperling.